Welcome all and thank you for joining today's AWRI webinar. My name is Robin Dixon. I'm a senior viticulturist at the AWRI. In the spirit of reconciliation, the AWRI acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I would also like to acknowledge Wine Australia for providing funding for the webinar program via the AWRI Extension Project. So in this session, we'll be looking at recovering from hail damage, looking back on what we've learnt from the 2021 season. So this webinar is the third in a series of episodes on hail recovery. So if you haven't seen the other webinars, I encourage you to go back and have a look at them. You can find them on the AWRI website. So before we jump in and make a start, there's a couple of quick reminders. So if you want to ask a question, you can click on the Q&A button down the bottom and send through your question at any time. You can also fill out any comments in the chat section, but if you can please put your Q&As in the Q&A section, that would be great. And this webinar is being recorded as always, and you will be sent a link to the recording after the webinar. So for anyone who has just joined us, welcome. Today we are looking at recovering from hail damage, looking back on what we've learnt for the 2021 season. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Chris Rogers and Tarita Furlan to our webinar today. So Chris has over 30 years of experience in viticulture across technical, management and grower liaison roles. He is a Charles Sturt University viticulture graduate and has formal training in winery operations, health and safety, quality control and team leadership. He also works closely with growers across other wine regions of South Australia, providing holistic support to growers. So Chris, if you're ready to go, I'll invite you to start sharing your screen.
Okay, thanks, Robin. So today my presentation will be, I'll do sort of two parts. Let's get this slide moving. So I'll just give a quick overview of the numerous events across Australia. I'll be obviously familiar with that, and then probably outline more particularly the Barossa event, which Tarita will certainly talk more about. And then after Tarita's presentation, then I can talk about some more general observations, what we learned from talking to many growers, my own observations and a few take-home messages. And I guess it stands to reason, we know the hail's been pretty devastating, economically and emotionally, and there's a lot of variations on what's occurred. But I guess in terms of just going through the events, so the Barossa, the major event, was on 28 October. It's pretty severe. I'll touch on that a bit more in a moment. There was another quite isolated storm in February, actually, in northern Barossa around Greenock. But I guess compared to the Riverland, there was, three quite serious events. The one on 28/10 sort of hit certain areas. That was on the same day as the Barossa one. Then another pretty severe one on the 6th of November, and then again on the 11th. Great Western, one major event. These are sort of intel I've gathered just from talking to people around the country. Drifts, I didn't have specific dates, but from what I've been told, there was potentially 3 different events there, of different severity and location. Canberra had quite a severe event in early January. And there were also a couple of events around mid-November in the Orange area, but each one is quite different in itself. So it's a pretty high-level summary. Impacts, obviously varied a lot. I'm certainly not a climatologist, so I'm not about to make any speculation about the future probabilities. The little bit I could find is really not much research on this whole issue here in Australia as far as what the future might look like. So best leave that there. The Barossa hailstorm, 28th of October, it was a probably unprecedented in the fact that it was a very wide band, covered a very big area. The Barossa and Eden Valley has had its hailstorms before. This particular one, they did, cut a pretty wide swath through Barossa Valley and then up over the range into Eden Valley out to Cainton. That's a big area. I couldn't tell you how many hectares, but it's a very big area. The thing with this particular hailstorm, unlike the ones in the Riverland, the wind speeds were actually quite low. But on that particular day after the hail had passed, we had a short burst of really strong wind at the end, which did cause a bit of shoot breakage in a few other vineyards. As to what sort of tonnage was lost, it's significant, but in all honesty, we'll never know with these kinds of events. So the duration of hail with a big factor varied, from very short bursts to 7 minutes is a pretty long burst. Riverland probably had longer. Hail size, people tend to talk about very big hail. There was some getting around that 22 mil. I think a lot of it was in that sort of 5, 10, 15 mil diameter, but that, as we know, is enough to do some pretty bad damage. And in different parts of the Barossa, there was heavy rain associated with the hail, which at times I think was another factor. It almost created so much pressure on the canopy. In some areas we saw shoot breakage, not from pure impact, but from that pressure, if you like. So the damages, all kinds of damage and severity was pretty variable, but you can see by that it occurred at relatively early EL stages, which, as I think we go through this, it'll put a lot of what myself and Teresa talk about into context. I guess the large hailstones obviously did a lot of damage. We didn't see quite the property damage we saw in the northern metro area, fortunately, but nonetheless, we did see a few cases of some pretty severe damage on canes and obviously quite severe leaf loss. The smaller hail probably wasn't quite as problematic to the ongoing damage, but still significant. As I said, talked about the low wind speed, but we still saw, quite a lot of bunch bruising. And the thing that was really obvious is cane prune Shiraz, open canopies, north-south rows, this came from the west, certainly copped the most damage. In other scenarios, you look at it and it didn't look too bad. Grenache and to some extent Cabernet seemed to resist the damage better, partly probably canopy architecture and shoot characteristics. And I guess later bud bursting varieties, vineyards, obviously didn't cop probably quite as much damage or probably are in a better position to recover. So I'll leave it there. I'll hand back to Robin and to Teresa, and then I'll continue on after that.
Thank you, Chris. So now it's a pleasure to welcome Teresa Verland to present for us. So Teresa is a metallurgical engineer turned viticulturist. After graduating from the University of Adelaide with honours in viticulture and enology, Teresa started her viticulture career working as a vineyard operator for Treasury Wine Estate in the Coonawarra and then technical officer at Australian Vintage Limited in the Adelaide Hills. Teresa is now the Vineyard Technical Officer and Supervisor with Barossa Valley Estate, where she is using her passion for research and problem solving to assist the vineyard team to manage challenges such as hail damage. Teresa, if you're ready, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. So I'll present the learnings here at BVA from the hailstorm. I'll start explaining the viticultural practices at BVA because it's a little bit different from the rest of the Barossa. We manage most of our Shiraz blocks as a 3-cane Scott Henry. And that means that we have 2 top cordons that are trained up and 1 bottom cordon that we roll down during the season to open up the canopy. And even though it's a different management system from most of the Barossa, I think what we learned from the hail event last year can be applied to most vineyards. We did some trials here when we used 2 blocks in those trials. They're both located at Marananga, blocks A and D. And we chose these 2 blocks because they were planted at different times. So we have different vine ages and different planting densities. So we thought we could maybe see some differences there. Here on the left, you can see an image of the bomb radar showing the hailstorm, and roughly at the same scale, you can see the location of the 3 vineyards of Barossa Valley Estate across the Barossa. The northwestern one is the Marananga vineyard, and it was hit pretty hard by hail. On the northeast there, you can see our Sapeltfield vineyard that was partially hit by the hail, and in the south, you can see our Krondorf vineyard, and we didn't see a lot of damage there. Our main concerns here, once we were hit by hail, was that in vintage 22, we wouldn't have the quality that we wanted. We would have damage to the existing canes and shoots. We were worried about our grape supply, both to our own winery and to our external customers, vine regrowth and nutritional requirements of the vines. And for next year, for vintage 23, we were worried about carbohydrate storage, primary bud necrosis, bud fruitfulness, and the quality of canes. So our first assessment, the day after the hail, we wanted to know how much damage we had. And we did incident severity score, which is the same methodology we use to assess pests and diseases. So here on the left, you can see a few pictures of the damage that we were seeing in the vineyard, and you can see some shoot damage. The damage to canes here, you can see that if we peeled the bark of the cane, we could see a lot of damage under the bark. And here, some damage to bunches as well. So we did an incidence score, and there was a score between 1 to 10 that was attributed to the percentage of shoots that were damaged by hail. And the severity was a bit more subjective, but we gave a score of 1 to 10 to the level of damage. And then we multiplied the incidence and severity and came up with a score for each of the blocks. We also did some bunch counts, and immediately we could assess that we had a bunch loss of 50%, and there was a potential crop loss of 75% based on the damage to the remaining bunches. The incidence severity score here at Marananga was on average for all of our blocks 82, which is pretty high. So we started looking at the options that we had, and we got in touch with a lot of experts in the industry just to try to get to the best decision that we could. Our first option was to leave the vines to recover, retain yield and harvest, and then spur prune in 2023. Our second option was to remove all the canes and just leave the crown, and all the regrowth would come from the crown. The third option was to retain only 1 of the 3 canes that we have, or 2 of the 3 canes that we have. After talking to a lot of people, we reached the final decision of retaining only 1 cane, so removing 2 canes out of the 3 canes that we have, and prune all of the canes that were left back to basal buds. And we decided to do that to all of the blocks that had an incident severity score over 60. The idea of retaining only 1 cane was just to secure the vine to the wire, because we realized that when we cut the 3 canes and leave just the crown of the vine was a little bit fragile. We wanted to ensure sufficient leaf area to support the vine throughout the season and create a carbohydrate storage for 2023. And we wanted to distribute the growth between the crown and the cordon as well. So here on the left, you can see on the top the picture of a vine that had just been pruned. So you can see that there is only 1 cordon here, and we pruned all the shoots back to basal bud. And on the bottom here, this is the last day of our pruning. That was the 17th of November, and basically our vineyards looked like winter. To understand what would have happened if we had taken a different route, we set up a trial of 3 treatments. We had 1 row per treatment in the 2 different blocks here in Marananga, blocks A and block D. So the first treatment was to do exactly what we did, retain 1 of the 3 canes and prune all the shoots back to basal bud with the objectives of growing good quality canes for 2023. And have enough leaf area to provide energy for the vines. The second treatment had the same objectives of the first treatment, but we sort of did a softer pruning and we left 2 of the cordons here. And the third treatment was our control treatment. We didn't do anything and we just let the vines regrow. Results. So the first measurement that we did was basically to count the buds that we retained, the count and non-count shoots. And just to explain here, the count shoots are the shoots that grow from the buds that we retained on purpose. And the non-count shoots are shoots that grow from other parts of the vine, especially the crown area. The control data that you can see here was the average of the whole block, and that was a count that we had done after pruning in 2021 before the hail. And then we compared that to pruning to 2 canes and 1 cane. But the main information here that I'd like to draw attention to is the non-count shoots, because in both blocks, you can see that pruning back to 1 and 2 canes increased the number of non-count shoots, which is exactly what we wanted. We wanted to have some growth around the crown to give us some cane options for pruning this year. Then we moved on to bud dissections, and here we divided the vine into different sections. The first section was the cordon, and we did bud dissections in the shoots that regrew from the basal buds from this cordon. And the second section was to do bud dissections in the canes that had grown from the crown area. And in both sections, what we can see is that the average number of inflorescences is lower in the control and higher in the vines that we prune back to 1 and 2 canes, 13 to 50% difference. The second thing that we can see here is that incidence of primary bud necrosis is higher in the control vines compared to 1 and 2 canes. And when we compare the 2 sections, if we compare the cordon with the crown area, we can see that there is a higher number of inflorescences and a lower incidence of primary bud necrosis in the canes that were growing from the crown of the vine. And that was the main driver for us to decide to go and do cane pruning this year instead of spur pruning. Now, looking at the carbohydrate reserves of the vine, we just started doing this analysis, and you can see here that we don't have a lot of samples, but in block A, we can't really see a difference between the 3 treatments. But if you look at block D, pruning it back to 1 cane increased the carbohydrate storage of the vine when we compare to the control vines. We still need to dig a little deeper and try to understand exactly what that data means, but it's quite interesting that maybe pruning it back to 1 cane actually set up the vine for vintage 2023 better than leaving the vines as they were. The other assessment that we did was yield. So basically we harvested the control rows and measured the yield that we would have gotten if we hadn't done anything. And the reason we didn't do the yield for the vines that we pruned is because basically there wasn't much fruit to be harvested there. We had maybe 3-4 bunches per vine, so it was not worth it. But when we look at the control rows, we can see that the bunch weights were 52 to 58% lower than our historical average. And the overall yields were 65 to 76% lower than our budget yields. And that was a good indication for us that pruning the vines back was probably the best decision. The last measurement that we did this season is look at the number of canes that we wrapped after pruning. And this we only finished this week, actually, because we're just going through our pruning season. But thinking about our 3 cane Scott Henry, the objective here is to always have 3 canes wrapped during pruning. And then when you look at this data, you can see that when you prune back to 1 cane, both in block A and block D, we have the highest percentage of 3 canes that we were able to wrap, and that directly affects our yield for 2023. So yeah, again, pruning back to 1 cane was possibly the best decision that we made. So as a summary of learnings throughout the season, I think the first one and very important one was to not really go with our first gut feeling and follow a methodology to approach the problem, because I think we probably wouldn't have made the decision that we made if we had gone with our gut feelings the next day after the hail. So define the issues, gather the facts, look at the alternatives, evaluate, and then make informed decisions was a good learning there. Looking at our repruned vines, we were able to stimulate growth from the crown, and we allowed good cane options for pruning season this year. The fruitfulness in the shoots growing from the crown is higher than the fruitfulness of the buds growing from the cordon, and the incidence of primary bud necrosis is lower. So that is an indication for us that cane pruning from canes growing from the crown is a better option than spur pruning. We fully expect our crop in 2023 to be back to our desired level, and then we can ensure grape supply both to our winery and to our customers. And it also allowed for additional UDPA control, because we weren't sure after the hail if the damage was actually entry points for UDPA infection. And when we pruned the vines, we used tebuconazole, and we could protect the vines from UDPA. And we also used the season, since we weren't going to crop anything, we used the season to retrunk a lot of things and do a lot of rework in our vineyards. Now looking at our control rows, not repruning the vines would have increased the incidence of primary bud necrosis and reduced fruitfulness. We would have had a reduced crop caused by a lower bunch number, lower bunch size, and lower bunch weight, leading up to 75% yield loss in vintage 2022, especially at a lower quality because we had a lot of second crop growing. And potentially we could have 25 to 50% yield loss for vintage 2023 because of lower number of canes after pruning and lower bud fruitfulness. So I guess the main thing for us this year was that with the power of hindsight, looking back at what we did last year, would we have done the same? And I think the answer is yes. Like looking at all this data, I think we made the best decision that we could. And for that, we'd like to thank a lot of people that were involved in this. Dr. Richard Smart, Peter Dry, Beth Lovis, Robin Dixon, and myself from the AWRI, Laura and Nini for all the help with measurements and pruning, and Aaron for the help with the carbohydrate analysis. And the whole BV team here, Roger, Alistair, Ryan, and Alan, because without the support, we would never have done this project right. So thank you.
Wow, thank you very much, Tarita, for sharing that information with us. It's a really thorough assessment of the different treatments, and I'm sure a lot of people get a lot of value out of that. So thank you for sharing. Now I'd like to invite Chris back to provide some information about strategies other growers used. Thank you, Chris.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Reverend Tarita. Yeah, it's fascinating. I really appreciate that presentation from you, Tarita, because I think that aligns very much with a lot of other observations, anecdotal data, and certainly I think for the people who watched the second webinar from the work that Mandy Marta did with bud dissection, primary bud necrosis, all of those very consistently align. So all right, better get to the right slide here. So yeah, so just recapping on, I guess, a couple of learnings. We shouldn't forget, straight after hailstorms, to think quickly about people. They're often, especially in the Riverland, I think there were some pretty hazardous situations. So, we always need to be mindful, and in many enterprise, that can mean actually thinking about don't have people coming onto your property when you've got flooded areas and hazards. So, people come first. So the other one that I guess that came up a lot in discussions immediately after the hail is botrytis risks, insofar as damage to shoots and sometimes permanent, but more so shoot areas, and the need to immediately apply a botryticide. I think there are, I guess I would stress, it's very much situation dependent. I guess the view in the Barossa, reflecting on the damage, reflecting more importantly on the climate we normally have, and obviously what did play out. I think people need to give great pause before they just assume they need to go out with a very expensive botryticide and spray their vineyard just because they've had a bit of green tissue damage or possibly severe damage. I think we need to keep that very much in context. I know Ian McRae from the Riverland and I talked a bit about this in previous webinars. I don't think it should be just a blanket assumption or blanket recommendation, and especially when you look at the cost of some of those botryticides. Sometimes they might be an integrated chlorothalonil as part of Bounty. But the other thing we need to think about with those is, are we actually getting the coverage that justifies them? Will this, if it was in a warm, wet climate, perhaps in the eastern seaboard, that inoculum risk is probably more significant. But in dry climates, I guess I think people need to think carefully about that. Damage it later in the season, like that small hailstorm in northern Barossa in February, with a very different scenario. There was that was damage on fruit after veraison, and you got highly vulnerable fruit. Mind you, in that situation, unfortunately, botryticides probably aren't going to fix some of the problems, and what we see is a lot of secondary fermentation and volatile acidity and fruit degradation that no botryticide will fix. So, very late season physical damage, hull damage to fruit is very problematic. Trunk disease risk is the other one that comes up a fair bit in discussion. Mark Sosnowski, I've spoken to him, and the SARDI are doing some research on this. They have got samples and they'll continue to do more research to come back to us with some more objective numbers. I ponder it's perhaps overstated in some situations. Very old cordon with a lot of bark layers is pretty resilient. You need some pretty big hail to create wounds that would create a significant, surface area. And of course, green tissue heals much differently, potentially quicker than a large pruning cut. So again, I think we need to be very objective and not jump to sort of reductive conclusions with that one. But yeah, I guess we'll have more data in time. So I guess the inevitable decisions, which Tarita's talked a bit about, and I'll touch more on some examples later, is to reprune or not. It's not, of course, a decision everybody has to make. It'll depend a lot on the damage. The thing I guess need to point out to you too, what we're presenting today is pretty Barossa-centric, and more to the point, the damage and the scenario we're talking about are very early season damage, quite early stages, incredibly different scenarios to what we saw in some of those other regions and the dates that I talked about earlier. So it is really carefully thinking about, as Tarita said, that really objective, unemotional assessment and decision-making process. Why would you do it? How would you do it? And when would you do it? And you do actually need to make those decisions fairly quickly. Obviously, an option is do nothing at all, and that was probably the majority, and that's nothing wrong with that. As we'll see, there's scenarios where that is probably the best decision, and there are others where it may not be. I guess by the do nothing scenario, if the damage is severe, then I guess it does open up the reality may well have to then be forced to take some later adjustments. Shoot thinning might sound odd, but in some situations that might help drive the growth where you want it, especially Terita's point is very valuable about getting that growth from the crown. Second crop, I'll touch on that a bit later, what those picking decisions will be like. So all these things have flow and decisions. Terita's talked about this. Certainly we saw some people bring forward their restructuring program. Whether you call it an opportunity, I guess you could, but sometimes these things force our hand to something we may have been going to do in the next year or two. Occasional, there might have been a vineyard that kind of, for what I might call, been into caretaker mode where, to my next point, it might have been the vineyard was going to be replanted anyway. So, you miss out on that last crop, but why spend any money on it when it's got no future? So I think, sometimes these things have to be looked at both, with the immediate scenarios, but what was actually going to happen with the vineyard, or what are the, alternatives. Labour availability was obviously a big factor when people started contemplating the repruning. I think obviously we've had labour issues, but I don't know too many where that was the only thing that stopped people going ahead with pruning. It was usually other decision factors. Economics is a big one, of course, with anything we do, not just repruning, spray programs. What was the crop level going to be? What's my budget look like now? And the big one, I think, again, Terita's touched on, thinking very carefully about what actually are the goals of the vineyard. What's the highest priority? Is it making sure you've got good pruning wood for 22, hence 23 crop? I guess sometimes it might be that every berry counted in 22, and in some situations we'll see doing nothing gave a better crop, but that has consequences too. 23 crop. Certainly young vines, there's scenarios with young vines, first, second leaf, restructured vines we talked about where they've been restructured, and then beautiful canes lap down, bang, almost have to start again. Top worked or field grafted vines, there was certainly some ones unfortunately got pretty badly damaged, and they required a lot of extra TLC and costs through the season, but that I think we'd all acknowledge is critical because you're setting up a vineyard for the future. So there's just some examples with the first webinar, sort of trying to give people a sense of some different scenarios. Severe, these are very severe damage. The top left is a vineyard I'll talk about in a moment. The top right is an example of a vineyard at Sepulchre Way got, I guess you might say, annihilated. This particular vineyard, they didn't do any follow-up work with pruning, and potentially you can sort of see why. The damage is so severe. The vigor in this Shiraz is pretty solid. They just left it, and fortunately they did drive some very good growth from that crown, from this area. Pretty messy pruning. I'm not saying they did the right or wrong thing, but when the damage is extremely severe, it almost makes the decision easier, if that's possible. Bottom left and bottom right's Mataro, younger Mataro, older Mataro. It seemed to very stiff, strong shoots of Mataro, but it almost seemed to just wipe all the bunches and leaves off. Bottom left, the grower did reprune, tried a few different things I'll touch on a bit later. Bottom right was repruned, but not all the way back. So again, each grower will have a different, I guess, perspective on how they want to deal with the challenge and what they want to achieve. And again, it's all about your goals. So this particular vineyard out at Gummersole was third leaf, so the first crop. So the grower went in and did a very quick objective assessment, came to a pretty quick view that, yes, I need to go through, as you can see, young vines, north-south roads, that's the high damage scenario. You can see that leaving that was never going to be a good outcome. So very quickly decided, went through, hand repruned the lot, left a couple of small sections as a control. And so basically this was where we went through with contract labour, quickly wearing gloves, and literally just wiped, ran their hand along the cord of the cane and just wiped the shoots off as fast as possible. He didn't mind the bottom situation where in some cases it tore the shoot almost out of the socket. It's left, I guess, a basal or in some cases even a tertiary bud. was quite comfortable with that. Happy to just drive the best shoot growth. Taking a very objective view to aiming to spur prune this off this winter, which was done. You see there's a bit of cane damage. The top one obviously is more of a cutting scenario. This case, the grower didn't really want to spend the extra cost of going through and literally cutting every shoot. So subsequent growth was very good. Pretty small crop, but very good health, very good shoot growth, which is exactly what this grower was after. There was a little crop. In early stages, wasn't sure if it was going to pick it. It was very much shoot growth, pruning next year, first priority. If there's a crop that's viable to pick, we'll make that decision near vintage, and decided it was. So picked on the 11th of April, which is probably, certainly for that area a couple of weeks later versus normal. Having said that, I did some samples on that untreated area, and the treated didn't see a lot of difference actually in biome. That's a pretty minor difference based on grape samples, probably due to the nature of the low crop anyway, and the nature of the vines and the canopy. So what I actually picked from the repruned 1.8 tonnes a hectare with his own machine was quite a viable thing to do. We don't have accurate yield data on the untreated, but by the looks of it, was around 3.5, possibly double the crop. Bigger bunches with that primary crop. The repruned, typically we see smaller bunches, tighter bunches. One person commented, I guess, in a botrytis prone climate that could create some problems. But this grower was happy with those canes. It's a bit of minor damage, so he basically is going to spur it off. The fruitfulness is good because we're talking about regrowth here, not totally untreated. But he's taking a view that he'll look at that cordon, if you like, next year and year after. And if he starts having some concerns about residual physical damage, then before that becomes established, he'll go back to cane pruning for a year and then back to spur. Another vineyard here in Tanunda. This was certainly in a very badly hit area. So I guess top left gives you an example of what it looked like before, and then in the background actually going through by hand and removing all of the shoots. See on the right there. So the photos in the bottom, I guess the point I'm making here is, with this case, again, the priority was all about growth. So going through and tearing out a shoot to the extent on that bottom left potentially could tear out the entire bud and even the basals. Generally it didn't. But the point was he wasn't concerned about that. It was all about driving growth from the crown, absolutely wanting to cane prune in 22. And I guess in other situations, he played around a bit where if you break the shoots in a slightly different way with a little bit more care, still by hand, you can potentially leave a basal if people want to chase a bit more yield. But that may come at the consequence of lesser growth for the next year. I guess, reflecting, chatting with him in quite extensively, as you'd imagine, it's a pretty overwhelming thing initially when you first assess it, consider what's happened, where do I go next, what are my options. It's emotionally pretty, heart-wrenching. And I guess it's really thinking carefully about what could happen. I guess my point I'm trying to make there, my slide didn't quite go to plan, but the point is, as he made a quote, consider what you'll gain, what you'll lose by everything you do. Think about what could happen if you do nothing. Try to envisage what the growth will look like. Try to envisage what the growth will look like if you do prune. What other things could occur? In this particular case, especially these two growers worked together actually and tried a lot of things, took the opportunity to learn. Let's hope we don't need this information, but probability says one day we will. And so that also is a very objective view with high-grade blocks in a complex Barossa vineyard. Absolutely, repruning was critical to get the best quality fruit, which what Teresa's talked about. In some other lower grade blocks, if you like, I guess only some of them are done very much around pruning with that Cabernet and so forth. I guess a good discussion is around that, cutting the shoots versus rubbing them off. I think we touched on that a bit in terms of thinking about time, costs, labour, goals, and what you're really trying to achieve, and it depends very much on the block. This particular grower had some Grenache, which, whilst it came through better than Shiraz and Cabernet, had first and second crop. And oddly enough, went to the view, well, I've got to need a market for some rosé. So about 65% of the crop that came off of it got picked early, about 13.5 for rosé, because that was, obviously ripened. The remaining fruit, about 35% of the crop, was quite green at that time, and then that was left to 5 to 6 weeks later for table wine. So I guess being a bit creative is often, important. Very good working relationship with their grape purchasers, in this case, several purchasers, and that's absolutely critical when you're going through a complex scenario like this. They did spray the tebuconazole after repruning, which I think is a very wise move when you've got so many wounds. And in their case, because they went in quickly, early, and on cane prune vines, a bit to that earlier scenario where they literally wiped their handle on. It was about $400 a hectare. I think that earlier one I commented was around about 13 hours a hectare. So done quickly, done early, by a rubbing method, is perhaps not as expensive as it might seem. But with spur pruning, of course, it's a much higher. You've got so many more shoots to work with. The physical nature of the cordon does make that much more difficult, possibly twice or even more. Their experience is certainly no extra fertilizer inputs. I'll talk about this more a bit later. I think that's sometimes the wrong assumption that we need to suddenly feed them up. They had very good regrowth, very good soil health vineyard, well managed mulch and so forth. So, and interesting enough, by delaying that canopy, the cool season, not having much crop, some blocks didn't need any irrigation at all in the 21-22 season. And at the harvest of the repruned blocks where that was viable was about a month later, roughly, which, in a warm climate like Barossa is certainly no issue. In a cooler climate, I guess you'd have to think about that carefully. So the yields they got across all the various blocks were were viable in some cases, and in others not. Shiraz was probably the variety was more variable. Had a couple of high vigor Shiraz blocks where the yield did actually end up around 4 to 5 tonne a hectare after repruning, but there were certainly several that were not viable to pick. The Cabernet and the Grenache certainly respond the best. One of their Cabernet blocks was back around 7 tonne a hectare, which is what they were targeting. So those varieties certainly do respond better. Pruning costs this winter just been, in some cases, up to twice normal. As we know, it is much more difficult, much slower. So I guess there are costs associated with doing nothing. That's probably the message there. Hence that, and of course, as Tarita's highlighted, it has consequences for the subsequent vintage. So again, I'll stress this is not a mantra about everybody having to reprune, but there are situations where the benefits, you must look at very objectively, can pay off. Wine quality, I guess jury's probably a bit out on that, and you'll get a lot of mixed opinion. In this particular case, certainly no complaints where repruning achieved a viable crop, a uniform crop, even ripening, good canopy architecture. By all accounts, it made very good wines, and we had a very favourable vintage. I guess the other thing is, work done with late pruning, pruning after frost, that second crop, if you want to call it that, we quite often actually see very good colour and often quite high acidity. So we shouldn't just assume, the quality will be down in those cases. Again, this grower being quite innovative, decided to consider some other things, contemplated machine pruning. The problem with that is really with a normal machine prune, it's very hard to get low enough, if not impossible, to truly achieve what you need to achieve. I've not seen it, but someone contemplated getting one of those big disbudding brushes. You can see them sometimes used for trunk removal. Chemical with a knockdown herbicide has been used, not here, but I know people have used that with frost. Certainly wasn't probably a desirable one for this particular grower, but what they did want to do is have a go with machine harvester. So what they did, working with another guy closely, is in a what they might call a lower grade spur prune Shiraz block. Came with a normal tow machine, traveling at about 4K an hour. The critical thing is to make it work. They're pretty innovative guys and probably were up till midnight doing this. They're making very short beater rods, about sort of 400-500 mil long, close pinch, and ran them above the cordon in a spur prune vineyard. Pretty high RPM, and literally ran across the top of the cordon. I'm sorry I don't have any videos, but you can appreciate how this probably worked to actually go through and break the shoots out, as you know, in a very rapid way. It certainly had to be done very quickly. Worked best at cool of night, turgid shoots when they're most brittle. Worked best on Shiraz. It's the nature of its shoot. Very short window of opportunity. They were seeing they went in this very quickly. And it got to the point where probably by the fourth day, once you got into the morning, the shoots were already starting to become, this wasn't working. Within, you know, it was almost the, I guess the turgor of the vine was starting to affect it. So the very short window of opportunity. And again, this is not to promote, this is a practice, but I think it's an opportunity to learn. So I guess their point would be, or I asked them a question, would you do it again? So the question that Sarita asked, and they said yes. If it was early damage, very early damage in season, that's a critical point. And obviously if it was severe enough to justify. The other point I made there, like anything with practices, you can have some unknowns, but I guess that's the case with anything. You have to make your best decision and just move forward. So there's some quick examples of some more moderate severe damage, if you like, not justified of repruning, or very rarely in these cases, to do that. So, but there's just some examples where sometimes these decisions can be difficult. Here's an example where that kind of damage led to a lot of regrowth of laterals and hence second crop, high vigor Cabernet. They did actually go through and hands in this. Pretty expensive, sort of in the 50 to 70 hours a hectare to remove that second crop. But I guess in this case, that's what they needed to do for the target. Another example of sort of high vigor creates different situations, a lot of unlignified wood. And that particular vineyard, as part of a Barossa demo vineyard, we actually went through and assessed the second crop. And whilst you can't see it here, it was about 3 bome behind, and it represented somewhere between 1% and 6% of the total crop weight. And the interesting thing is, it was in a treated vineyard with different methods of mid-row management. The highest vigor section, which was cultivated, had the highest second crop. So there's always that close correlation. In these low to moderate damage vineyards, really don't need to do much. I think there's not much you can do. But yeah, sometimes there can be issues with pruning. Some people did find some of the vineyards needed more, well, the pruning was more difficult than they thought. So quickly, some other nutrition programs. I think there was an inclination for some people to want to pour in water and fertilizer straight after hail. I would say, and you know, I talked about this in the last webinar, no, in the sense that unless it's late season damage, that's different, but early in the season, the depletion factor is not that great. And pouring on lots of fertilizer when there's very little canopy won't really be taken much. And it runs the risk of actually driving too much vigor, more PBN, more disease risk and so forth. You know, and more often not, more soil moisture is far from lacking when you've had a storm and a bunch of rain. Foliar fertilizers or foliar biostimulants and so forth were talked about a lot in the first webinar. Some of those have merit, but let's be honest, they're not magic potions and silver bullets. The stress imposed by physical damage is quite different to frost, heat, drought, stress damage. So let's not presume that foliars will fix everything. Spray programs, obviously some people needed to extend them later in the season for delayed harvest and so forth. Fruit set was certainly impacted, where we saw a lot of leaf loss and not much leaf above those bunches. That lack of carbohydrate to drive fruit set created some pretty low yields. Second crop management was certainly an issue, and hence that gets into the space of, you know, really good liaison with your grape purchasers and making sure you've got a merchantable crop. Harvest methods, I guess some people might have reverted to hand, might have been, I know one case is a bit of a selective picking in a vineyard where one end was badly hail damaged and one wasn't. So these are those adaptations you need to make. If you haven't done anything early to correct those, these things you kind of might become locked into. Post-harvest nutrition has been discussed a lot. When you've got a vineyard where it's re-established very good canopy, and I think Terita's talked to this, it's not like we need to pour on a lot of fertilizer to make up for it. Quite the contrary. They come through with good canopy formation right from early in the season, very little crop load, and vines accumulate reserves before harvest unless you're in a very high cropping situation. Pruning, obviously much higher cost and slower. The big call out of all the people I spoke to is it's actually quite challenging educating, supervising pruning staff when you're dealing with a much more complex situation. And, you know, cane selection is critical, especially if you've got a really congested crown. And I think to relate to what Mandy talked about in the last webinar and what Terita talked about, lateral canes are great. Sometimes you need a two-part cane, might be a primary with a lateral extension, as long as that bottom part is structurally sound. Any good cane is going to be better than leaving some horribly damaged cane and sparing it off when you're talking high PBN issues that Terita's talked about. If you're not sure, getting bud dissection is certainly a really good thing to look at to give you an understanding of where there may be issues, and if you need to change your pruning, you know, prune from the hail side with your staff so they can make the right decisions on seeing the damage. And I think in this coming growing season, some people may even need to be doing a bit of shoot thinning to rebalance their vineyard if their cane and spur structure is not quite what they need it to be. And you can get a lot of your money back at pruning in the following year by doing that. So I think it's all about going for structure and quality, not just bud numbers. And some will take 2 to 3 years to remediate, there's no question. I think the people who repruned, restructured will more quickly remediate their vineyard. So yeah, to take home messages, I reiterate, I think exactly what Terita said, you know, get in there quickly, thorough, unemotional, objective assessment, gather the facts, assess each block exactly. I think case by case basis, a variety can make a huge difference, row orientation, etc. Be really clear about what you want to achieve. Don't overreact and make simple assumptions is certainly a big one. And then have a plan and just get on with it and do it quickly. There might be some tweaking you do later. And there's plenty of support out there. Look after yourself. The good thing was we saw a lot of support programs through regional associations and PIRSA especially. You know, talk to your neighbours, talk to anyone, gather all information, and, you know, I think about your own well-being as well. And the reality is, you know, grapevines have a very remarkable capacity to recover growth. They are a pretty resilient plant. So that, you know, that's always good to bear in mind. And not to make light of it, you know, storms can bring some pretty unexpected outcomes sometimes. So it's this was in the Riverland. So, you know, it creates many challenges. I think there would have a couple of children here probably a bit unhappy about this. And my guess is Dad was probably even unhappy at how the hell he was going to get that down. But anyway, a little bit of humour sometimes keeps things in perspective. To just finish with acknowledgements, big call out to Bros Australia. They had a very good support program for the work that myself and Mandy did, and the input from Daniel Faber-Haberman, Steve Schuller, Tim Leish, 3 growers in the Bros that spoke a lot about their experiences, some of which is in the presentation. I really appreciate the support and the work Mandy's done. And obviously, big call out to Australian Wine Research Institute and to you, Robin, for the opportunity. And we've had lots of long chats about this, and I don't know if there's many subjects that get 3 webinars in 10 months. So it's great to see, you know, modern communication helping people out. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chris. And now I'd like to invite Terita to rejoin us for the Q&A session. Thank you. So some really, really interesting info there, some really good learnings. So essentially, to summarize, doing nothing in your situation, Terita gave a yield of around 25% of what you were budgeting, but the quality was lower due to second set. Whereas when you pruned it back to the basal buds, whether it was leaving 1 or 2 canes, essentially you lost all of the fruit for that year. But what it did do was set you up for the following season, so 2023. So you had less PBN, more inflorescence, and it gave you the opportunity to rework your vines as well. So I guess my question was, and Chris, you touched on this a little bit, so was pruning easier where you had done the 1 or 2 cane treatments, cutting back to basal buds, compared to when you did nothing? So I assume there were, where you did nothing, you had more shoots and they were less quality.
There's 2 ways of looking at it, I guess. We had one of our blocks that we weren't sure if we should reprune it or not, because it had a lot of damage, but we decided to leave. And that was a good experience because it's harder in the sense that you can't find good canes to wrap. So you need to leave a safety cane just in case it breaks during the wrapping, and then you can use that. So it took longer because it required a little bit more attention, and also to go back and cut the safety cane in case you didn't use it. But at the same time, where we repruned, sometimes we had so much growth that they're having a hard time pulling that wood out. So it doesn't necessarily make it cheaper, but definitely gives you a lot more options when you're pruning, and then you can reset the structure of your vine for next year a lot better.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think Chris made a really good point about the economics. So some growers might not have the luxury to lose all of their fruit in 1 year by pruning it back to 1 bud and spreading that loss across 2 years, maybe their only option. But for BVE, it really made logical sense to focus on last year, get rid of all of the fruit, but then set yourself up for a productive year this next year.
Yeah, I think we're really lucky in that sense, and we had the support of the company to make that decision as well. So
okay, wonderful.
Not everyone's that lucky.
Yeah, and so thank you for Trevor Yardley for saying that last one was a great presentation. I think that was yours, Teresa. So thank you, Trevor. It was a very good presentation. Do we have any other final comments from either you, Teresa, or Chris on this topic?
I'll certainly reiterate what Teresa said, that and I was chatting with Daniel and other people who pruned, that repruning of, in the early seed didn't always make pruning cheaper now, but it all came a lot down to vigor and the structure of the vine. But the having options will always pay off, versus having, I've seen some vineyards where you went in there to prune, you just go, well, what am I going to do? You just did not want to try to spur off seriously damaged canes. And I guess there's obviously a theme here too with what we both presented, is we are talking about cane pruning scenarios. I think the evidence is very strongly in favour of repruning. When you spur pruning, yes, it can be, I think, but it can highly dependent on the situation. And I suppose if there was another message, is know your vineyard, know the kind of growth. I know you can't always know what will happen after hail, but think about, what is the rate of growth? What is its vigor? What are you doing? And yeah, I guess take opportunities to learn.
Right. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Chris and Tarita, for sharing your experience and knowledge about hail recovery. It is a real privilege, I feel, to be part of an industry that really shares knowledge and experiences to help others overcome these sorts of challenges. So thank you both for sharing that with us. I'd also like to thank the audience. It's always great to get that participation. Thank you. And just to remind you that this webinar has been recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out to you. So the next AWRI webinar is on influencing tropical thiol concentration in white wine by combining foliar sprays and yeast selection. So this webinar has not been advertised yet. It is running on Thursday, September 1st. So watch out for and I think it will come out on an e-bulletin with the link. Alternatively, you can just jump on the website and register for that webinar. So thank you again, Chris and Tarita, much appreciated. And thank you, everyone. See you again soon.
Bye.